Hello everyone and welcome to our third lecture here in chapter 20. In this lecture we're going to take a look at the Atlantic slave trade. So one of the most important historical events in world history, as well as one of the most depressing ones in world history. But we're going to take a look at this event. We're going to spend quite a bit of time kind of studying the Atlantic slave trade, its effects, where people come from, and then also what happens in the Americas as well. And hopefully you guys will enjoy this unit and learn a lot. Now, before we get started into this actual lecture, I want you guys to actually take a second, pause this video, and look at this map, okay? And when you look at this map, focus on a few things. One, if you look at Africa, look at where people are coming from, okay? And then how many people are coming from those specific areas. What does that tell you about those areas? And then I want you to look at where they're going to. Okay, so where are the slaves going to, or where are the Africans going to that are going to be sold into slavery? Okay, and then also pay special attention to the insert there into the Caribbean and so forth, because there's a lot going into the various islands. So I want you guys to pause the video, like I said, and pay attention. What do you see? Where are people going? All right, so now that you guys have a chance to do that, we're actually going to look at some of this a little bit later in class. You guys have a link and see the number of voyages. We're going to do a little activity where you guys will actually track some of the voyages from the Atlantic slave trade. All right, so when we're looking at the causes of the Atlantic slave trade, or the slave trade in general, we have to look at really everything. But we're going to first look at Africa itself. And you need to understand, in Africa, slavery had existed in various forms for centuries. One such example we've already covered in this course is the practice of slavery under Islam. And as you guys remember, Islam was a strong religious force in Africa and was extending ever more during this period across Africa, specifically on the East Coast and in Western and Northern Africa. So that had actually led to an expansion of slavery, okay? And specifically in the Islamic sense, selling non-Muslims into slavery. And over about a 1,000-year period of Africa or Islam being on Africa, you had roughly about 17 million people, approximately, that were sold into slavery in this form. Okay, but it's a little bit different in terms of the slavery that's going to actually develop in the Americas. It's not racially oriented. It's more a religious-based one, and some of the slaves actually have their own legal rights. They can own property, they can become generals, become politicians, or higher-ups within a government, and even gain their own freedom. So it's quite significantly different than what we're going to talk about in terms of the slavery that develops in the Americas. Now, the other thing you need to look at is there's demand. So why was the slave trade such a big deal? Well, there's demand, and it's not only demand just for the slaves themselves, but what they're actually going to help produce as well. But let's talk about the slaves in general. So you have colonization. So we just talked about colonization specifically in the Spanish and Portuguese territories in the Americas, as well as the British, French, and Dutch, but mainly in terms of the slave trade, focus on what's going on in the Spanish and Portuguese territories or colonies, and you're seeing the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native Americans in these various colonies, and it creates a demand for labor. And if you also don't just consider the deaths of Native Americans because of disease, you also have to look at it in terms of the Spanish in particular, like we talked about their silver, the mining conditions and working conditions within the encomienda system and so forth are creating a new source or new system or demand for labor, So all this new demand for labor leads to Africans being demanded as slaves, or high demand for them, And there's a few advantages behind why Africans are chosen. And I want you guys to star these, make sure you understand these 4 reasons, because they're very, very important. Okay, 1, unlike the Native Americans, Africans have had exposure to European diseases. They're in the same area, they've had the same immunities that are built up. 2, they have experience in farming, particularly in the techniques that Europeans are used to. So they're actually used to some form of farming that's close to plantation work, if not the exact same. So you don't have to teach any new skills. 3, they're unfamiliar with the land. So if you take the Native Americans, they're familiar with the land. If they escape, they know where to hide, they know where to go. Africans don't necessarily know that. And then 4, and this is the obvious one, skin color. Okay, Africans have a unique skin color compared to the Europeans as well as the natives. You know exactly who they are and why they're there. Okay, and all of this demand for labor and these reasons leads to the Atlantic slave trade taking off. Okay, now I already mentioned it a little bit here when we first came on the slide. Spain and Portugal are going to be the first ones to lead the way here from a European standpoint. And remember, it gets its start because in Brazil, the demand for sugar and the sugar plantations there lead to the slave trade taking off. All right, now we're going to talk about why it spreads, though. The slave trade spreads primarily because of England and becomes very popular because of England and its colonies in the Americas. They have more colonies. They continue to develop more colonies over this period, and as more colonies developed, there's more of a demand for slaves. And England grows to actually not only help expand the slave trade, but becomes to be the dominant figure in the Atlantic slave trade. They actually transport 1.7 million slaves during this period, the latter part of the slave trade period, which may not seem like a lot compared to, like, if you look at the total numbers, but it's still a significant portion of it. And that's just their position in it, not the other European countries as well. So they transport the slaves to the Caribbean. Okay, this leads to more sugar and cotton production, which means that can be sent back to Europe, whether it's England or whoever we want to talk about, and they can turn that into a manufactured good or use it and make money off of it. Okay, roughly only about 400,000 slaves are additionally sent to America. That slave population grows slowly, but it does grow steadily. And by 1830, you have roughly 2 million to 2.5 million slaves that are actually in the United States at that point. All right, now let's talk about the triangular trade. It's the trade of slaves, or the Atlantic slave trade of what we call it, is really only one leg or one part of a bigger trade system that's called the triangular trade system. So you actually need to know what each leg of this trade system is. So the first one is European manufactured goods are sent to West Africa or traded with West Africa. What do I mean by manufactured? Think of finished goods, things that have been multiple products and stuff that have been put together, finished into a final product, and then sent to be sold somewhere else. Firearms, for example, would be a good one. That's the first leg. The second leg is slaves are then exchanged for these goods to be sent to the Americas. That's the slave trade angle of it. Okay, or another term we're going to get to it in a second, called the Middle Passage. The third and final leg is where the slaves harvest the resources, sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, whatever. Have it get harvested, put it back on ships, and it goes to Europe. So there's your triangular system. It's a perfect trade system. It offers great wealth, and it's well balanced. Okay? All right. Here you can see this trade actually in motion. So here's the first leg, Europe to Africa, manufactured or finished goods. Africa to the Americas, you have slaves, and then you have resources that have been produced or harvested by the slaves and then sent in the Americas and sent back to Europe. Okay, now let's talk about what this Middle Passage actually is. It's the voyage from Africa to the Americas. It's the middle of the triangular trade legs. That's why it's called the Middle Passage. All right, it's known for its immense cruelty, poor conditions for the Africans on board the ships, where they're tightly packed. They're whipped, beaten, disease is prevalent, they're not fed very much, and many die of disease or abuse or even outright murder in some cases, and then there are many that actually turn to suicide in a number of ways because the journey is so bad. And it's estimated that roughly about 20% of all slaves across the period of the Atlantic slave trade do die in the voyage from Africa to somewhere in the Americas. All right, so now once they get to the Americas, it's a pretty harsh life. It's not really, it's better than what it was if ships because you're not as tightly packed, but it's still really, really bad. And typically how it worked is slaves are going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Families typically would be split up to, again, devalue them as humans and also break them down in terms of resistance. You see slaves they work in mines. They primarily work on plantations, and there are the lucky few that end up being servants, where they're going to be working in less gruesome conditions in most cases. But it's a really grueling existence. It's pretty terrible. There's little food, long hours, dirty, poor housing conditions, and they suffer from constant threat of beatings. Whether they're warranted or not, they do take place. Now, this is where slavery starts to get a little bit different from what we talked about, the African slavery or the Islamic slavery. Okay, this poor condition stuff is a difference. Another important difference is that this type of slavery is lifelong if you're born into it. It's lifelong for the people that are sold into it, and if you are born into it, it's hereditary. Okay, you will stay a slave. Where in the cases of, if we look at Muslim slavery, a lot of times the kids, if they had kids and they were a slave, those kids weren't slaves themselves. Okay, there was a possibility for that. Okay, now, as in any case throughout history, if we talk about some other culture, government, whatever, coming in control of another area and subjugating somebody in some form, okay, there is going to be some form of resistance to it. Now, there's a lot of resistance that develops during this period in the Americas with slavery, and we only touch on a couple here, but if you guys want to get into it, there's some really interesting examples throughout history of the types of resistance. But typically, most workers, they're going to have more of a passive resistance, such as working slow, damaging tools. As time goes on, you see more and more slaves run away. If you guys get into American history, think of the Fugitive Slave Acts and stuff to try to return slaves that have run away. There are rebellions that do take place, and as time passes, they do become more frequent. The two important ones for you guys to think about in terms of this period in history that we're covering, you can think of the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, and the most important one, and actually the really only truly successful slave revolt in history, the Haitian Revolution in 1803 and 1804, where the slaves revolt and actually gain their independence. And we'll talk more about this. And if you guys actually take AP World History with me, and even AP United States History with me, we will talk about the Haitian Revolution and its impact and how it's similar to and different from a couple of other revolutions that take place either at that time or just before it in the American and French revolutions as well. Now, a lot of times, another thing you have to think of, how did slaves cope with life? They sang songs, told stories. They tried to keep their culture alive. And we'll actually play some songs. I won't do it here on this video, but we'll play some songs and listen to some. And some of these that you guys actually already know, you've heard of before in class, that were developed during this period for slaves to cope with the work and lives that they were living. All right, so let's talk about the consequences here. There's a lot of consequences, and I would start this slide as well. First off, let's talk about Africa, and we can't do this justice here in terms of what Africa's effects, how it's affected by the slave trade, because it really still truly is. And one of the main reasons why Africa is fairly poor is because of the effects of the slave trade. Now, there's many other reasons for that we can't get into here reasons for imperialism and so forth later on, but they're still suffering from the effects of it. You see cultures lose generations of able-bodied young people, both men and women. You see families that are torn apart, with some that are lucky enough to stay at home, stay in Africa, while others are sent overseas, and they never see them again. So the family unit, social structure is completely damaged. So you look at just an individual culture, or group of people, they can't function very well anymore, if at all. And then you also have the introduction or prevalency, expansion of guns being introduced into the continent. So from a war standpoint, or conflict standpoint, that's a huge change. And then there's many others. We just don't have time to talk about all of them here. the Americas, the consequences are the colonies survive and they become highly profitable. Okay, you can look at any one of them, whether it's Spanish held, French held, British held, or eventually American held. They become very popular or profitable. Sorry. Now, in a positive light, we do see a new form of culture being created, whether it's in the form of art, music, religion, languages, food. I mean, food's fantastic. If you guys ever had any cooking that's kind of developed because of the mixture of African and European and Native American cuisines, you're missing out. You need to try some. And you see the populations of the United States, Brazil, the Caribbean, and eventually other places like Canada and other places throughout South America, they are transformed. And you guys actually have an example of these transformations of each of these areas by looking at these three athletes on screen. Okay, now I don't expect you guys to know all three. You should know that this is Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time. Sorry, it's not LeBron. There's no argument. But he is an example of the consequence or effect of slavery here in the United States. Okay, if you look here, this is Leandro Barbosa, another former NBA player. He is an ancestor of slaves that were sent from Africa to Brazil. And then you have Fernando Rodney here in the Seattle Mariners uniform, but a former Detroit Tigers pitcher, go Tigers, that is an example of this consequence in the islands of the Caribbean. He's from the Dominican Republic. So you still see that today in the people, in why culture is this way in certain areas, or why people look the certain way they do, or portions of the population they do. It's because of the effect of the slave trade. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. This is a very, very important lecture. Please take notes on this. Feel free to research. If you guys have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.